to please start. Thank you, Rabbi Kahn.
You're very welcome, and thank you for giving me the opportunity. Now, this one, although many times, most of the time, I usually do not connect the two topics. However, this is one exception. This topic is a little bit connected to what we spoke about last time. However, you do not need to know anything of what we spoke about last time to follow this class, so you do not have to worry. Essentially, what we started discussing last time was the halachic reality that the Korban Omer, which we are in the middle of right now, we have the Sefiras Ha'omer, the counting of the Omer. The Omer is referring to a special Korban, a sacrifice that was brought in the Beis HaMikdash, and it really allowed for the new grains to be used outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Now, what that means is you would have had grains that were planted in the ground before Pesach, and after Pesach, after the second day of Chol Hamoed, it would be permitted, by the second day of Chol Hamoed, it would be permitted to then take part of these grains and to eat them. Now, the interesting thing is that really, for the most part, most people have never heard of this law. And it's very logical that they haven't, is because the custom, the very common custom for centuries, we're talking about centuries. Already the Rabbeinu Usher, who lived from 1250 to 1327, you're talking about close to 800 years ago. And I'm sure it was before then as well. It was very, very common practice to not be nervous about this at all. And the question that has bothered many, many, many people is why. Now, I'm going to try to present a few different ways of dealing with this question. And the first question that obviously one has to deal with is maybe the whole assumption is totally wrong. Maybe we don't have to worry about it at all, even in the simplest sense. How do we know that we do? If most people have not, and a very, very select few have, so then who says that they're right? Maybe they're just wrong. So that's the first question that needs to be asked. Now, there are a few ways that sometimes things, especially when dealing with the Beis HaMikdash, they are connected to the Beis HaMikdash, obviously, and they can only be fulfilled, and they're only applicable in the times of the Beis HaMikdash. Now, there are hundreds of examples of this, but I'll just give one. Is, for example, the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. The Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, his avoda can only be done if there's a Beis HaMikdash. You can't do it if there isn't a Beis HaMikdash, because guess what? There's no Kodesh HaKadoshim. There's no Holy of Holies. There's no place for him to go. It just doesn't exist. So that's just one example, but there are many. This one, however, it seems, is not one of those. If we look at the Gemara says in Maseches Menachos, on page 68a, we have a Mishnah. It says, Mishakarav Ha'omer Huter Chadash Miyad. Once they bring the Omer, that means they bring it on the altar, then immediately the new grain is permitted for use. Harachokim, so those people who are far away, meaning obviously in those days they did not have the technology that we had. They don't have instantaneous communication. So they didn't have somebody, tweeting and texting in the Beis HaMikdash saying, oh, guys, it was brought already. We can all eat the new grain. They didn't know. So they had to use assumptions, good assumptions. So here, harachokim, the people who were far away from the Beis HaMikdash, because those who were really close knew already it was brought. But those who were far away, mechatzos hayom lahala, they were permitted to eat from midday. So right now, chatzos is somewhere around 1-ish o'clock, a little bit later than that. So today, right, if it would have been today, it would have been about 1 o'clock, right? By, let's see, the second night the Seder was about 1:27, I think. So about 1:27 in the afternoon, they would have been able to eat it without a problem. So then the Mishnah continues, Mishacharav Beis Hamikdash, once the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed, Hitkin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Sheheh Yom Hanev Kulo Aser. He said that, you know what, rabbinically we'll say that the entire day of the day that normally the Korban Homer would be brought is going to be prohibited. So that means the first day of Chol Hamoed would be prohibited. Very interesting. Well, wait a second. If you're going to tell me that the rules of laws, that's pretty clear from the Gemara. So again, we're left with the question: why isn't the general public nervous about this? So I'm going to talk about 4 approaches to this and these halachos. There are others, but I'm going to talk about 4. If we have time, maybe I'll talk about a different one, but we'll see how it goes. So first, as with most things, we start our discussion with the Shulchan Aruch. Right? When you're talking about what your common law is, you want to look at the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch, again, written about 1595, and it was written by Yosef Cairo, and he was at the time located in Tzfat, and 1565, I think. Whatever it is, it was in the 1500s, later half of the 1500s, and he writes that in 2 places. I'll read you them both. One is in Hilchos Pesach, that's in Orach Chaim, that's in the section that discusses the daily occurrences, davening and Shabbos and Yantif and all that stuff. So he says, Asr lechol chadash af bizman hazeh. It is prohibited to eat the new grains even in today's day and age. Bein lechem, bein kali, bein carmel. That's based on the pasuk, the 3 different types. 3 different types of things. Ad tchilas leil yud ches benisan, until the beginning of the night of the 18th of Nisan. Uba Eretz Yisrael, ad tchilas leil yud zayin benisan. And in Eretz Yisrael until the beginning of the 17th of Nisan. Again, that's after the 2nd day of Pesach. In both cases, meaning the first day, after the first day of Chol Hamoed. That's an Orach Chaim. Pretty simple. He just says that it's absolutely forbidden. There's nothing to talk about. Now, in Yoredeya, which is a whole different section of Shulchan Aruch, he has a whole siman devoted to the laws of Chadash and the Isser. So here in Sif Beis, in the second line, he says, Isser HaChadash noig bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. He says the prohibition of eating the new grains, that means prior to when it becomes permissible, is both in the land of Eretz Yisrael and in outside of the land of Eretz Yisrael, bein b'shel Yisrael, bein b'shel ovei kochavim. Whether it is from Jewish crop or non-Jewish crop. Now we're going to discuss that in a minute. That is a major discussion that we will only touch upon a little bit. But basically, your first approach is, oh well, everybody has to be worried about it. Why aren't they? He says they're wrong. That's the first approach. That's the Shulchan Aruch. Now, the second approach is the Ramah. The Ramah in Yoredeya, he actually doesn't say anything in Orach Chaim, surprisingly enough, but in Yoredeya, he says, Umi kol makom, nevertheless, kol stam tavua shari lachar Pesach. Any general grain, if you just go to the store and you buy it, is permitted after Pesach. Now he explains why. Mikoach sfeik sveka. From the power of what's called a sfeik sveka. Now, sfeik sveka is not so simple at all, and it's very complicated. A lot of different rules on how to apply it. So just a very, very basic introduction is that if you have 2 totally separate questions on the prohibition of this item, and in both directions it could be permitted, then it's going to be okay. It's going to be permissible to have. So if you, again, it's a it's some people call it like a double suffix, like a two-part suffix. It's not exactly that. It really has to be two totally separable questions, and both of them would make them permitted. Now, sometimes this actually works against us, quote unquote. It's always for us if we are following the halacha, but it works to make something actually prohibited. You can also have what's called a sfeik sfeika l'chumra. That means that in both directions, you could have a way of making it prohibited, and that's where you're going to go with it. But here, it's there's two totally variant possibilities of why the general grain is permitted, and therefore we just say it's permitted. You don't have to worry about it. Now, so here he explains, what is this double doubt? What is this double doubt? So he says like this. So he says, Safek hi mishana she'avra. Maybe it's last year's grain. So that means right now is what, 2020. So it could have been from 2019's grain. So what does that mean for us practically? So, because again, for the new grain versus the old grain is determined by Pesach. So if it's last year's grain, that means it was in the ground before Pesach of 2019. Okay, so that's the first question. We don't know. It might have been in the ground before Pesach of 2019. Okay. So that's the first question. So obviously, if now we're in 2020 and this is grain from Pesach of 2019, it's totally permitted because it was in the ground before Pesach then. So it was already permitted a year ago. So obviously, right now it's permitted, and there's no problems at all. Okay, so that's the first question. The second question is, V'im timtzo lomer mishanazu, and if you're gonna tell me, you can't say that it's permitted from last year because it's newer grain. It's this year's grain. Okay, so now that's more problematic, right? We don't know now. Now, if you would have just one suffix, we'll get into that in a second. So he says, if you're going to tell me that it's from this year, maybe it was rooted before the Omer. And once it's rooted before the Omer, then this Omer permits it. Okay, so let's go over this again. It's a little bit complicated. I'm gonna go over it another time or two, and we'll see if we get it clear. Okay, so the general rule is that if you have what's called a doubt, a suffix, you're not sure, right? Let's say, for example, you have one piece of meat in front of you, and I don't know where it came from. I have no idea. It could be kosher meat. It could be not kosher meat. I just don't know. So the general ruling is, well, if it's not kosher meat, that's a Torah prohibition. I'm sorry, you cannot eat that meat. So the same thing would be true in most any case. If you have a doubt on whether something is permitted and it's a Torah prohibition, then you would say, I'm sorry, you cannot eat it. That's called safek de'araisa l'chumra. That means when you have a doubt on a reality and a law that has to do with the Torah level, then one has to be stringent and one cannot be lenient. So in our case, if you would have grains that you knew was this year's grains, it was planted for year 2020, not for year 2019. But I'm not sure if it was rooted before Pesach or not. I'm just not sure. So that would be prohibited according to the Ramah. However, since most grains, he says, right, it could be that it was really from last year. We don't know. So it could be that it's from last year. Now, obviously, you would have to have this possibility of being from last year. Otherwise, there's nothing to talk about. If you know that it's definitely not from last year, so then there's absolutely nothing to talk about. So here, it could be from last year. That's one. And number two is that even if it's not from last year, but it's from this year, so now it could be that it was rooted in the ground before Pesach, and therefore this year's Pesach permitted it. So that's the sfeik sfeika, the two variant ways of making it permitted that would allow the Ramah to feel confident that this grain would be okay. Now, this approach is not simple, neither to explain nor in the halachic sense, because there's a few different issues that come up. Here are two of them. I'm going to just discuss two issues. Now, as I said before, Sveka is not a simple topic. It's quite complicated. There are a lot of rules. One of those rules is that you cannot have two questions that are really the same. As I was trying to say, you have to have two variant questions, totally different. Now, in our case, from a halachic perspective, there's no difference between the grain being planted last year and the grain being planted this year, as long as it was before Pesach. Once it was, not planted, rooted. As long as it was rooted in the ground before Pesach of 2020, that is the same thing as if it was planted in the ground before Pesach of 2019. It wouldn't make a difference in regards to these laws. So some ask, well, hold on a second, Ramah. This is the same question. Was it planted before Pesach of 2020? Was it rooted in the ground? If the answer is yes, then it's permitted. If the answer is no, then it's prohibited. So why are you asking this question in two ways? It's the same question, right? Sounds valid. So it's the same question. So what's going on? Now, so the Aruch HaShulchan, also very relatively recent sefer, very important. He died in 1908. He wants to answer this question. And he says, in reality, there's a large difference between whether the grain is planted from before, if it was rooted in the ground before Pesach of 2019 or Pesach of 2020. There is a difference. So he has to come up with a difference. Otherwise, it's really the same question. So he says, "V'li teshaper havi sveka." I think it's really a good sveka. Now, just as a side point, what's very interesting is the Ramah, right? This is Rav Moshe Isler. So Rav Moshe Isler also lived around the 1500s. He did not make up this logic. It is not his own. It was written already by the Rush, as I mentioned before, Rabbeinu Usher, who lived in the 1300, like 1250, I said, from 1250 to 1327. The Rush was one of the biggest Ashkenazi Rabbanim at the time. Very interesting story, actually. His teacher actually was put in jail, and he died in jail. And the Rush ran away to Italy, not to Italy, I'm sorry, to Spain, to escape persecution and himself being put in jail. So but this is not the Ramah's own idea. This comes from the Rush. So to ask this question, there's probably a good answer to it because the Rush put it himself. So the Aruch HaShulchan says that it seems to me that it's a sveka because there is a big difference. What's the big difference? He says, there is a halachic difference between the two questions. If it's from before Pesach of 2019, you can't use that grain for the Korban Omer of 2020. Because in order to use the grain for the sacrifice of the Omer, it has to be the beginning of your harvest. Meaning, every year before they would bring this sacrifice, there was a whole process and a whole to-do about it, right? I think we're going to discuss that a little bit in the next chair. There's a whole process of harvesting this grain. I mean, literally, they made a whole procession out of it. There was lots of announcements. Am I going to use this scythe? Yes. This scythe? Yes. This scythe? Yes. I should cut it? Yes. I should cut it? Yes. I should cut it? Yes. Like really a big to-do. So this to-do could only be done with grain that was at the beginning of its harvest. Meaning it's still in the ground. We are now harvesting this year's crop. Well, last year's crop is out of the ground already. Or if it's still in the ground, it's the very, very, very last, not the beginning. So the Torah tells us that you have to bring Reishis Ketzircha El Kohen. You have to bring the beginning, the first of your harvest to the Kohen, not the end of your harvest. So he says that by fact that the Torah tells us that it has to be the first of your harvest, therefore, you would not be able to bring the Omer, this korban, from last year's grain, which gives us the reason that the two questions are not the same. There's a big difference. The first, last year's grain, was fine for last year's Omer, but not for this year's Omer. So maybe it was last year's grain, and it wouldn't be able to be used even for the Omer. But perhaps it's this, even if it's this year's grain, it was rooted before the korban Omer was brought, and then it would be okay, it would be permitted. Okay, so he says, and he quotes the Gemara who says this, Vimhu mishanazu, and if it's from this year, Mevin mimenu asa Omer, then you could bring the Omer for 2020 from this grain. Uklalohu b'sfeik sveika. And now he tells you, this is the general rule in sfeik sveika. The kol sheyesh nafkamina bein asfeikas, as long as there's a halachic distinction between the two questions. So in this case, the question of whether it's last year's grain or this year's grain, the eze prat ladina, in any detail of halacha, af she'einu noeg bizman hazeh, even though it does not apply in today's day and age, chashiv l'sfeik sveika. That is considered a sfeik sveika. So he says, although the Ramah, it's really essentially the same question, since there is a detail in halacha that is different between the two realities of whether it's this year's grain or last year's grain, that allows it to be a sfeik sveika. Right? Okay, so that's the Aruch HaShulchan trying to answer for the Ramah. Again, a little bit complicated. I'll just try to summarize it again. Is that when you have two variant questions that shed doubt on the prohibitedness of an item, then in general it will be permitted. So in our case, when we have grain or we buy a bag of flour in the store, we're not going to know necessarily whether it's from this year's crop, last year's crop, and even if it's from this year's crop, it might have been planted in the ground, rooted in the ground before Pesach. So if that's the case, you have two variant ways of making it permitted. Either it was last year's crop, or it's this year's crop, just it was rooted before Pesach. So the question is that that's really the same thing, because it just needs to be before this year's Pesach. So the answer is no, it's not the same thing, because since last year's crop cannot be used for this year's korban, therefore it makes it different. Okay, so that's the Aruch HaShulchan's answer for the Ramah. Okay, so another issue that is really of rabbinic nature is something called davar sheyesh lo matirin. Davar sheyesh lo matirin means that if I am going to have something mixed into a mixture, so I have, let's say, actually this is a really classic example. It's something that's the new grain, right? It's now before Pesach, and the new grain is not yet permitted, but it will become permitted right after the Korban Omer, right? So I have one kernel, tiny little insignificant kernel of the new grain, and somebody by accidentally dropped it in a silo of old grain, all new kernels. You can't tell a thing of a difference. There's a billion more kernels like it. So says Chazal, I'm sorry, you can't eat any of the kernels, none, right? That's assuming that it's mixed in and, theoretically, it could have been anywhere. The answer is you can't eat not one of those kernels, zero. Why? Just wait, and it'll be okay. Why would you eat it now when you have to depend on certain, what's called nullification? Don't depend on nullification, just wait. So that's what Chazal say. So here the question is generally we would not permit what's called a sfeik sveika, as we discussed, when it's davar sheyesh lo matirin. So why over here are we permitting it? we should just wait a little extra. It'll be fine. So the Ramah writes in Siman Kuf Yud that Yesh Omrim, the Davar Sheish Matir Nein Lahater Mikoch Sveik Sveika. One should not permit a Davar Sheish Matirin when there's a Sveik Sveika, even when there's a Sveik Sveika, right? That's what we just presented. So here you have one kernel of a possible new grain. We don't know what it is. It could be last year's grain. It could be this year's grain, right? But it's right before, it's before Pesach. So it's thrown in, boom. He says, I'm sorry, you gotta wait, because maybe it was planted after Pesach. So you'll have to wait. So that's one opinion. Another opinion says, V'tov lahachmir im lo letzorich. So the Ramah says it's best to be stringent, meaning that if there is a sveik sveika, and there's something that will become mutter right away, it'll become mutter later, you should wait, if possible, right? Meaning, if not possible, then you can eat it, right? Because anyways, it'll become permitted. So in our case, right? So the application for us would be if you had that one grain, right? Of you don't know what this grain was. It might have been rooted before Pesach. It might have been rooted after Pesach, right? You're not sure, but it could have been from last year's grain too. So here you have that sveik sveika. So he says, seemingly, wait until the next year's Pesach, and you'll for sure be able to eat it, right? So why should we allow any general grain? Just wait until the next year's Pesach. So the Shach deals with this. He's a major commentary on Shulchan Aruch. So he says, okay, so he gives two approaches to why. Really, the question that he's dealing with is why in one case the Ramah rules seemingly one way on this and a different way in somewhere else, where in one case he's allowing suffix sveika to be used, while in a different case he's not. So he answers that so he says that he believes that the answer is as follows. That when do we say that davar sheyesh lo matirin, meaning this concept that the Chazal say, since it's going to become mutter anyways, you can't eat it until it becomes mutter on its own. So when do we apply that, even by something that has this doubled out, this two alternative ways of thinking about it, is only when it's in a mixture. But if I go buy a bag, right? If I have grain in front of me, there's no mixture here. I'm asking, is this grain permitted? Is this grain not permitted? I don't know. So he says in that case, that is not the case. Right, so he says, Avol sveik sveika ki hai she'al hatavua ani omer shuhu yashan v'im timtzal omer shuhu chadash shema hishrish kodem la'omer vein kan iser chadash klal ke hai gavna lo asrin in sveik sveika b'davar sheyesh lo matir na'ay kamashal. So he says that he thinks the answer is because it's different. When you're going to say, when we're going to be stringent on this is only if it's in a mixture, but not if I'm looking at the item itself. I'm saying, is this permitted or not? So in that case, you would not apply the rabbinic dictum of davar sheyesh matirin that we just wait. You don't have to wait. You can eat it right away. You can apply the doubled out, we'll call it. And anyways, he ends off that in that case of grain, there's a huge need, right? I mean, today that's a big question of whether there's such a strong need. But in the old days, you had serious problems in certain places. The ground was frozen until after Pesach. If they didn't eat the grains, most people wouldn't have food to eat. That was just it. There would be almost nothing to eat. So obviously, in those times where there was major food shortage, I mean, you can't call it shortage. That was just the norm. They didn't produce as much as as much as we do today, or if they did, it wasn't divided up in the same way. I mean, again, most people had to do their own crops. They had to grow their own, otherwise they wouldn't have had food. Okay, so that's the deal with the first part of the Ramah. Now, the Ramah, he continues that basically he says that if you know that the grain was planted after Pesach, so he says either because there's certain types of grains that they just plant after Pesach, that's it, or if the ground was totally you couldn't plant it, it was frozen until after Pesach, there was absolutely no way that there was any grains planted after Pesach. So then he says there's really two ways of going about this. One is that you should be stringent. However, if they have importing, meaning they import their grains from other places, and those other places generally plant before Pesach, and it was rooted before Pesach, so then you could be lenient also using a similar logic. So that's really the Ramah. So the Ramah ends up basically saying that in general, if you have a general year and you're not sure whether the grain was planted before Pesach or it was last year's grain, you can be lenient. If you know for some reason that the grain is definitely not having been planted before Pesach, it wasn't rooted before Pesach, there's no way. Either because you know that it's planted afterwards or because the ground was frozen, so then you would really have to be stringent. So that answers a little bit, but doesn't fully answer for why the general public has not been so stringent about this. Now, the two remaining positions that I'm going to be talking about are basically what people have been dependent on this is what everybody is quoting. One is the Bach, Real Circus. He was huge, very important Rav. His opinion is highly held, and most of his opinions are discussed afterwards by either his son-in-law or anybody else who came afterwards. People are very concerned about what his opinion is. And the other one is really the presentation that I'm giving from the Aruch HaShulchan, but this is an old, he's really depending on old Rishon and other Rishonim, so it's not, he didn't make up this idea. So the Bach, basically, and very summary and succinctly, again, this is a very highly debated opinion, but this is what many people in Klal Yisrael are depending on. The Kitzur Shulchan Aruch quotes it, says the reason, and others, everybody is quoting the Bach. He says that anything that is grown by non-Jews, I think it's outside of Eretz Yisrael, but it's non-Jews, no problem. It's permitted. There's no issues. So that is his opinion. Again, he lives from 1561 to 1640. This is what everybody is dealing with. But that's basically what he says, that it's grown by non-Jews, it's fine. The final reasoning is the Aruch HaShulchan. Now, again, he died in 1908, and he quotes from an Or Zarua. The Or Zarua was a Rishon, a very important Rishon, and he says that really outside of Eretz Yisrael, the whole prohibition is only rabbinic in nature. And because it's rabbinic, therefore, the way that they made this prohibition was only applicable to places that are close to Israel. That's what he says. So he says all the places that are far away from Israel is not under the issue. There's no prohibition, because it's just, there's no way that you would mix it up. There are other examples of this. For example, Trumos and Maasros, or the different rules about places called like Surya. Surya is a place very close to Eretz Yisrael, and they have different rules of for challah and for Trumas and Maasros. So here too they apply the same idea. And the highly debatable point of this opinion is whether we really hold this way. There is a Rishon that says it, but most Rishonim don't really go with that. But he says that this has been it's not only his opinion, there's many Rishonim who hold that way. And he says this is the basic of why people have been lenient about it. And that's really it. So just in summary, there is a concept called new grain versus old grain. And if you look at the sources, many of them seemingly point to the reality that, it starts from the Torah. The Torah tells us that we're not allowed to eat the new grain until after the Korban Ha'omer is brought. And the question is, what happened? Why aren't all of Jews, why aren't they too nervous about what grains they bring into their house? So we showed that it's not dependent on the Beis Hamikdash existing, and it seems that there are a few approaches. One approach is that they should be. That's the Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah says there are certain doubts that come into play because we're not sure exactly when the grains were rooted in the ground. And because of those, we weren't sure, so therefore we are able to be lenient. But if we do know, then we have to be stringent. Again, that answered part of it. That got us a little bit better. It's just we're not sure why, we don't even look into the grains when they were planted. So the two other approaches are either that if it's grown by non-Jews, so then it's fine. And the other approach is that the whole prohibition was really only rabbinic and only applicable in the places around Eretz Yisrael, very, very close to Eretz Yisrael. Those are the two main approaches that people are dependent on. Now, what's interesting is that I saw it's just so interesting just because, how far people are really trying to explain minhag. It's just the fascinating thing about this entire topic is the strength of when an entire section of Jews is doing something for years and centuries. It's very hard to change that and we don't, again, we don't just throw it out. We don't just say, well, they're totally wrong. What are they doing? Years, many great Rabbanim have been really working very, very hard to try to explain this. And nobody wanted to just, sort of throw them under the bus. They don't just say, well, they're totally wrong and they shouldn't be doing that. For the most part, they try to give explanations, and some of them accept the explanations, some of them don't accept the explanations, but nobody denies the custom. And it just shows how strong and powerful the concept of custom is in Jewish law. So that's a basic rundown of why of the basic ideas of what's going on, of why people are lenient about this. Again, obviously, for practical questions, you have to ask your Rav, Rabbi Fish, and see what he says and how to practically apply this. Now, I would be remiss to not mention that there has been one person really for the last, he just passed away, I think last year or 2 years ago, 35 years. He has really spearheaded the research on what grains are in the stores when and not. Rabbi Yosef Herman Zatzal, who passed away, and he's done an amazing amount of work. I actually, in between last year and this year, I got a response, and they have literally the USDA tracks about when things are planted, when things are harvested, daily. Weekly, I think, maybe. But it's pretty amazing how careful they keep track. And these people, the Rabbi Yosef Herman, really for the last many years has been tried to make easier for anybody who would want to be stringent on these laws to keep it as best as possible. So that's really anything. If anybody has any questions, please reach out. My email is rabbikahn@jacksonvillecolel.com. I would be happy to continue the discussion if anybody has any questions.